In every country, every economy, and every life, there is a number that never stops growing: the world's total debt. It stands today at over $300 trillion, a figure so large it defies comprehension. Politicians promise to pay it down. Central banks raise interest rates to control it. But behind every effort, the number only rises, quietly, endlessly. Debt has become the bloodstream of civilization. Nations borrow to survive recessions. Corporations borrow to survive competition. Families borrow to survive life itself. But what if this isn't a mistake? What if the system was built this way, designed to keep every generation owing more than the last? In 1971, when the world abandoned gold, money stopped being wealth. It became debt itself. Every dollar, yen, and euro came into existence through borrowing. From that moment on, paying off the debt meant destroying the money supply. The real question isn't whether the world can pay its debt. It's whether it was ever supposed to. Because once you understand how the machine works, you realize the system doesn't collapse when the world goes bankrupt. It collapses when it stops borrowing. The story of modern debt begins not in a bank, but in a crisis. The year was 1914, and the world's great empires were preparing for war. Armies needed weapons, ships, and steel. But gold, the foundation of every currency, was finite. Governments discovered that war could not be fought with limited money, so they did something that would change history. They printed promises. Bonds were issued to finance war spending. Citizens were told it was patriotic to lend money to their governments. Those who bought these bonds weren't just supporting their country, they were unknowingly participating in the birth of a new kind of money. Every bond, every IOU, was a promise backed not by gold, but by future productivity. After the war, the world was covered in debt. The gold standard, once seen as unbreakable, began to crack under the weight of paper promises. Central banks emerged as the guardians of this fragile new system. Their job was no longer to protect gold reserves, it was to manage debt. In 1933, the United States formally broke its citizens' link to gold. Private ownership of gold was banned, and dollars were declared to be legal tender for all debts. That phrase, printed on every note, wasn't decorative. It was the legal acknowledgement that money and debt had become indistinguishable. By the end of World War II, the world had learned a dangerous truth. Debt could create prosperity, temporarily. The U.S. government borrowed and spent to rebuild Europe. Factories roared to life. Wages rose. The illusion of limitless growth took hold. But beneath the surface, every dollar of new prosperity was matched by another dollar of debt. Then came Bretton Woods, 1944. World leaders met to rebuild the global monetary system. They agreed that the U.S. dollar, backed by gold, would anchor the world economy. It sounded stable, but the world was already borrowing far beyond its gold reserves. The seeds of collapse were planted even before the ink dried. As Europe and Japan rebuilt, their exports flooded global markets. The U.S. began sending more dollars abroad than gold it could redeem. Foreign nations held paper they could, in theory, exchange for gold, but there wasn't enough gold left to deliver. The promise was already broken. By 1971, when President Richard Nixon suspended the dollar's convertibility to gold, the transformation was complete. Money no longer represented wealth, it represented debt. From that day, every dollar in circulation began its life as a loan, created by banks, multiplied through credit, and owed back with interest. What began as an emergency measure to fund wars had quietly become the foundation of the world's economy. Nations no longer competed over gold. They competed over who could borrow the most. The world had entered a new era, one where prosperity was indistinguishable from indebtedness, and there was no going back. When the world left gold behind, it entered a new kind of prosperity, one built on credit, not savings. From the 1970s onward, nations learned that debt was not just a burden, it was fuel. The more they borrowed, the more they could grow. And for a while, it worked. Governments discovered the power of deficit spending. Borrowing wasn't a failure, it was a policy. They issued bonds to fund highways, schools, and social programs. Politicians learned that debt could buy votes, smooth recessions, and delay hard choices. And as long as economies expanded, the debt seemed manageable, because every dollar borrowed appeared to create more than a dollar of growth. Corporations joined in. They realized that taking on debt to expand operations, acquire rivals, or buy back shares made their profits and stock prices soar. Wall Street evolved into a debt machine. Investment banks didn't just sell stocks, they packaged, sliced, and resold debt itself. Mortgages became securities. Risk became a product. The global economy became a web of promises built on promises. Ordinary people followed the same pattern. Credit cards, mortgages, student loans, each one a small reflection of the same global addiction. To own a home, start a business, or even get an education, one had to borrow. Debt had become not a trap, but a rite of passage. By the 1980s, interest rates fell and borrowing exploded. The Reagan and Thatcher revolutions promoted deregulation and free markets, but beneath the rhetoric was a deeper truth. The global economy was hooked on credit. Governments ran deficits, consumers lived beyond their means, and corporations leveraged every balance sheet. Growth no longer came from innovation, it came from expansion of credit. China watched and learned. When it opened its economy in the 1990s, it used the same playbook. Massive infrastructure projects, financed by state-owned banks, turned debt into the engine of transformation. Skyscrapers rose, factories multiplied, and GDP numbers soared. The same system that had fueled the West now powered the East. But there was a flaw, an invisible paradox at the heart of it all. Every dollar of debt had to be repaid with interest, but the money to pay that interest could only come from more borrowing. If one person's debt was another's asset, then someone, somewhere, always had to keep borrowing to keep the system alive. By the early 2000s, total global debt had tripled. Economies celebrated record growth, but that growth was financed by tomorrow's income. The world had built a skyscraper on quicksand, magnificent, fragile, and impossible to stop. Debt had become the invisible architecture of modern civilization. It built our cities, powered our corporations, and filled our homes with things we didn't yet own. The irony was complete. Debt had not only built the modern world, it had become the world itself. Every politician promises it. Every generation believes it. We will pay off the debt. Yet behind the curtain, economists and central bankers know a quiet truth. No one ever does. The global financial system depends on the illusion of repayment, not the reality of it. Debt is rolled over, refinanced, reissued. Old bonds are replaced by new ones, at higher values, with new promises. When governments pay down debt, they rarely use real revenue. They simply borrow again, under different terms, from different lenders, at a different interest rate. What looks like repayment is merely transformation. The reason lies in the mechanics of modern money. Every unit of currency is born as debt. When a bank issues a loan, it doesn't lend out deposits, it creates new money. That loan becomes someone's asset, someone else's liability, and the total debt grows larger. If all debts were repaid, the money supply would collapse and the economy would suffocate. The system can only function as long as more people borrow than repay. Governments have perfected this balancing act. The U.S. Treasury issues bonds to pay old debts, while the Federal Reserve quietly buys those bonds with money it creates from nothing. Japan has done this for decades. Its central bank now owns more than half its national debt. Europe followed suit after the 2008 crisis. Central banks became the world's buyers of last resort, ensuring the illusion continued. Money without end, debt without consequence. But illusions have limits. Interest payments consume larger portions of national budgets. When interest rates rise, the cost of maintaining the illusion multiplies. In 2024, the U.S. government spent more on interest than on its entire military. That is not repayment. It is servitude. And yet there is no alternative. If governments stopped borrowing, economic activity would fall. If corporations stopped leveraging, markets would crash. If consumers stopped taking loans, demand would vanish. The world's prosperity hangs on a single thread: perpetual expansion of credit. This is why recessions are treated like emergencies. A slowdown in borrowing is not just bad news, it is existential danger. When credit contracts, defaults rise, banks fail, and governments panic. In response, they do the only thing they can. They borrow and print more. The cycle repeats endlessly. Each crisis is met with new stimulus, new debt, new promises. What was once a temporary solution has become a permanent feature. Humanity has built a global economy that survives not by paying its debts, but by never stopping. In truth, the debt can never be repaid, not because of mismanagement, but by design. The entire system was engineered to expand forever. The real danger isn't the debt itself. It's what happens when people stop believing it can be managed. As the world moves toward 2030, the illusion that debt can be controlled is unraveling. The last decade was defined by a series of global shocks: pandemic, war, energy crises, and inflation. Each one demanded massive government intervention. Each one financed with more borrowing. The result was predictable. Global debt exploded past $300 trillion. But something deeper changed. The world stopped pretending repayment was possible. Central banks, once the guardians of monetary restraint, became the world's largest debtors. During the pandemic, the Federal Reserve printed trillions to stabilize markets. The European Central Bank did the same, and Japan continued its decades-long experiment in quantitative easing. What was once an extraordinary emergency measure became a permanent economic strategy. Printing money was no longer taboo, it was survival. But this survival came with a cost: inflation. When every crisis is solved by creating new money, the value of that money erodes. Wages lag, savings lose power, and the middle class quietly drowns. Governments then raise interest rates to fight inflation, which increases the cost of servicing the debt they created. Every solution feeds the next problem. Meanwhile, the private sector mirrors the same dynamic. Corporations borrowed record sums during the low-rate years to buy back shares, creating artificial wealth. As interest rates rise, that debt becomes toxic. The smallest shift in credit markets can trigger global panic. The 2023 U.S. regional bank crisis was a warning shot, just a taste of what happens when the cost of debt collides with reality. Emerging economies face an even sharper blade. Many borrowed in U.S. dollars, but as the dollar strengthened, their repayments grew unbearable. Nations from Argentina to Egypt struggle under crushing external debt, forced to choose between paying creditors or feeding citizens. For decades, debt was sold to the developing world as a path to progress. Now it has become a weapon of control. China, too, finds itself caught. Its property market, once the symbol of unstoppable growth, is suffocating under trillions in hidden liabilities. Local governments, state banks, and construction giants owe debts that can never be repaid. The model that lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty now threatens to pull the entire system down. By 2030, the debt spiral will define geopolitics. Nations will compete not for gold or territory, but for credit. Who can issue, who can default, and who can print without consequence. Debt will no longer be just an economic metric, it will be the instrument of global power. The world is reaching the point where debt creation no longer produces growth, it only delays collapse. Every dollar borrowed buys a little more time, a little more illusion. But history has shown that every empire built on credit eventually meets the same fate. Confidence fades, currencies break, and the cycle resets. The clock is ticking toward a moment the system was never designed to survive, a world that runs out of belief before it runs out of money. Every financial system begins with trust and ends when that trust runs out. The modern world has built its wealth not on gold, not on labor, but on confidence in paper and promises. But confidence, like oxygen, is invisible until it's gone. The cracks are already showing. As governments print to pay interest and banks lend to cover old loans, money itself is becoming detached from meaning. In theory, money represents value, a claim on goods, services, or effort. But in practice, it now represents expectation, the hope that someone somewhere will keep borrowing. When that hope fades, so does the system's legitimacy. We are entering an age of monetary schizophrenia. On one side, nations promise endless growth through digital innovation, green energy, and artificial intelligence. On the other, they rely on debt-fueled stimulus to keep those dreams alive. Central banks talk about tightening while simultaneously injecting liquidity to prevent collapse. It's a system that must move, not forward, but simply move, because stillness means death. As 2030 approaches, the conversation is shifting. Politicians now speak openly of debt forgiveness, universal basic income, and central bank digital currencies. But these aren't solutions. They are signs of mutation. Digital currencies will give states direct control over every transaction, allowing debt to be managed not by markets, but by algorithms. What began as an economic system is evolving to a system of surveillance and social engineering, where spending, saving, and borrowing are programmed, not chosen. And yet through every crisis, the same pattern repeats. Collapse begets reform, reform begets new debt, and new debt begets the next illusion of prosperity. The world has been here before. From the Roman denarius debasement to the French assignats, from the Weimar mark to the 1970s dollar shock, every empire has stretched its credit until it snapped. But this time, the scale is global. There is no external standard, no neutral currency, no nation untouched by leverage. The debt is not out there. It is in our mortgages, our pensions, our savings, our very notion of progress. To end the system would be to end the world as we know it. So the debt will not be repaid. It will be transformed through inflation, currency resets, and silent confiscation of value. The losses will not appear in ledgers. They will appear in the shrinking power of every paycheck, every retirement fund, every promise made to the next generation. When money forgets its promise, society forgets its truth. People stop saving, stop believing, stop planning for a future that feels rigged. And when that day comes, history will not call it a default. It will call it a reset. Because debt was never meant to be paid. It was meant to keep the world spinning until the music stops and everyone realizes there was never any chair at all.